Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As some of you may know, I have been chair of an organization called Transit Alliance for the last about 5 years, and on that board for a long period of time. Before that, prior to that, I was chair of an organization called Mississauga City Summit, and transit and how we're going to move in the future was one of the key topics there. And I think it really is one of the only ways that we make our city livable, but at the same time livable and commutable, but still, knitted together. Because without transit, we're not going to be able to get from, one part of the city to the other. One of the best examples I had of that at one point in time is someone said, you know what? If someone invites you to dinner in Scarborough or Mississauga for like 6 o'clock, you probably say, no way. I'll come at 8 maybe, because then I'll be able to get there in a reasonable time. But to get across our city during rush hour is actually impossible to do in a reasonable time. And so this transit's got to not only make it easy to get to and from work, but hopefully to and from friends and to and from cultural activities and to and from each other. It's got to knit the city together. I ran into this guy on social media. WB Transit is his name, at least that he goes by. And he's got a whole series of fascinating pictorials of transit ideas that have existed in the past. And I thought it would be really helpful and interesting to run through them. And the basis of a lot of them is making use of former existing freight rail trains, railways, and turning them into passengers. WB, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. How about you? Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. So this is a map of all the rail lines in and around Toronto. And it's interesting that there's so many. And obviously, the big change in the 1960s was that the Lakeshore line, that's a CN line, I think, had an eastern freight bypass that moved the freight off of the Lakeshore line up to north of the 401, actually north of Highway 7, that opened up that Lakeshore line, and it converted into GO Transit. And that was sort of the beginning of rail-based transit in the Greater Toronto Area. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. So that bypass really did help contribute to GO Transit beginning. The map you can see here is actually a part of the one of the studies that brought up GO Transit originally in the early 1960s. This map in particular shows all the lines that were considered for passenger rail. Considered doesn't mean that they were going to happen. It just means that they studied the feasibility of passenger rail on this line. And obviously, the Lakeshore line is the one that ended up opening. But you can see various different lines here. You can see lines from Burlington to Barrie. You can see some lines going through North Oshawa up to Guelph, even to Sutton. It's they basically studied all of the rail lines that circled Toronto at the time, just to see which lines were the most suitable for passenger rail. And
And
we
the
ended up
ones
getting the
that
Lakeshore line from that.
and obviously the Lakeshore line is the one that's been exploited the most. The CP line that comes from Milton and then goes down on a diagonal through Mississauga, goes through Bloor Dundas there at Bloor Dundas Rossesvalles intersection. And then it actually continues across the city. The GO train doesn't. The GO train goes down to Union Station, but the rail line, the freight rail line, actually crosses the city right at Casaloma, at through the Annex, at the Summerhill LCBO, goes out by the Science Center, and continues out past the zoo, I think.
It does. And originally, when the Milton line was being conceived, multiple times in multiple proposals, they planned it to go from Milton to Malvern instead of down to Toronto Union Station. So it would have taken that line through Midtown Toronto, past Casaloma, past Summerhill Station, all the way to Malvern. Obviously, that didn't happen, unfortunately, but the line still exists, which means that in the future, anything is possible.
It's interesting when I think about that line, it carries a fair amount of freight traffic on it and some dangerous goods. And Lake Megantic, we had, an issue with dangerous goods. Calgary, there was an issue with dangerous goods and spills. And in 1978, there was a spill, obviously, in Mississauga on that line, which was the largest peacetime evacuation in Canadian history. But for some reason, Lake Megantic, they built a bypass. Calgary, they built a bypass. In Toronto, they still haven't built a bypass.
So a bypass was proposed multiple years ago. It was named the Missing Link Project, and it would have brought, I'm not fully versed on the subject, but I believe it would have brought the line up to the CN bypass line north of the 407, and then down to the CP yard in the east. This line, if built, would have freed up multiple rail lines in the Toronto area, including the Midtown line for passenger rail use. But obviously, that line was unfortunately not built. I don't think that project is under consideration anymore either.
You know, it's a real shame. You can see it here on the map. If you look at it, there is this freight line that goes right across the northern part of metropolitan Toronto. And that's a CN-owned line. And the CP line is really at, you know, the Meadowvale Lisgar station area. And there's a 407 that goes right along that route that left a right-of-way for a rail line that could have been built. And if that was built, and it was actually proposed in the 1960s, there was an eastern freight bypass that was built in the 1960s, proposed and built in the 1960s to take the CN freight off of the Lakeshore line onto this northern line. The western freight bypass was proposed, but never built. But if it was built, as you say, you would free up, you know, all that land, all that, you know, rail lines through the major part of the city. And it's interesting, you may have seen that there was an announcement by the Prime Minister of Great Britain just this past week, talked about the Elizabeth line, which is really a similar kind of line. It's across the London line, because historically all of the train lines in London came to London but didn't cross London. So they built this cross rail, which was renamed the Elizabeth line. And it's already paid the money back and had a 200% return on investment already after 2 years of opening. And they said that it carries the equivalent of 26 lanes of traffic in Houston, of freeway traffic, in a great train system that goes through and across the city. So I think it's a real shame that that mid-Toronto line has not been built. And it could have been built if all we did is got that CP freight off of that line that goes right through the center of the city.
It is very unfortunate. And what's even more sad about it is since I do look through old Go proposals and make maps, as you said, it's been proposed so many times. If I were to give a rough number, I think I would have seen that line in multiple proposals, maybe about 20 proposals use that line. So multiple planners over the decades have seen how viable that line is, but nothing's ever happened.
This one that you've got is kind of it, I think. It starts in Burlington. I guess it would go up to Milton, go through Mississauga, come down to the junction, go through at DuPont subway station near Casa Loma, then the Summerhill LCBO, then out to Malvern and out to Pickering. It would be like the Lakeshore line, but not on the waterfront, right through the middle of the city.
So this line was proposed a part of SuperGo, which was a project proposed in the early 1970s by the government of Ontario, and it involved electrifying the Lakeshore line as well as the newly opened Georgetown line. And additionally, there was two high-speed rail lines proposed, one from Pickering Airport down to Summerhill Station in Toronto. And this line, this high-speed rail link between Burlington and Pickering going through Midtown Toronto. High-speed rail has a very wide stop spacing, so I'm not sure if it would have necessarily been the best choice, as opposed to maybe just a heavy rail system, electrified, sort of kind of like the Lakeshore line was intended to be. But it would have brought people through Midtown Toronto. It would have reduced congestion at Union Station. It would have brought hundreds of thousands of people transit access that doesn't still today have transit access. And overall, it would have been a very important line if built.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people don't realize this, but that Summerhill LCBO, please correct me if I'm wrong, was the major CP passenger rail station in Toronto prior to World War II. You know, the Union Station was for CN, the Lakeshore line, But Summerhill LCBO was a major passenger railway station. And that proves that, at some point in time, it made a lot of sense to have a rail crossing in the center of the city rather than just at the south end of the city.
I believe you're right. Yeah, I believe it was the secondary main station in Toronto at the time. It's unfortunate that it's only used as a LCBO now, and I guess also a subway station. But it still exists. It can still be used for passenger rail service if passenger rail service is along that line is deemed viable again.
I think it's a real shame because I think that the statistics I've heard is that 97% of all go rail traffic travels through Union Station. And so, what we've got is not a network, but, everything coming into Union Station. And so if we could get some of that traffic going somewhere other than Union Station, we would improve our transit and our development in Toronto fairly dramatically because too much is centered on Union Station and the area of the financial district down there. If you could get people going across the middle of the city and getting off either at DuPont and getting on the University line or at Summerhill and getting on the Yonge line, particularly if they weren't working downtown, but were working in Yorkville or University of Toronto or somewhere on Yonge Street or the hospitals, it would, spread out the traffic and congestion fairly dramatically. And it would give you a way to get from Mississauga to Scarborough with rail fairly easily rather than having to go through Union Station.
For sure, it definitely would have been a very useful station. Union Station is going to be overcrowded again by the end of the decade, which is why they're currently building another concourse, as well as provisions for possibly more on the east side of Bay and the west side of York. Um, but yeah, Union Station is the only major station in the GO Transit network where all the lines meet. There's not many other. You have Bloor and Weston, but that's only between Up Express and Kitchener Line. There's really no other places for people to transfer. It makes it so if there was an issue at Union Station, the whole network is affected by that. Trains can't divert to Summerhill or people can't go there instead to get access to downtown. It's a very unfortunate situation we have that we're not using that station.
We've got a whole bunch of other ideas that have been looked at in the past that we're going to review. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in 2 minutes chatting about transit in the Greater Toronto Area. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As I mentioned off in the top, I'm chair of an organization called Transit Alliance. I've always been interested in transit and transportation, and I'm convinced it's a game changer in really knitting the city together and making it economically viable. And I came across a guy by the name of WB Metro on Twitter, and you got to follow him because his ideas are absolutely fascinating and amazing. And what he's done is he's gone back into the old Go Transit files and has publicized a bunch of the things that were talked about at some point in time in the past. And it gives you an idea of what's possible. So WB, let's review, if we could, some of the other, ideas that have been talked about in the past. And there was one that you shared called the ALRT. What was that all about?
So Go ALRT was proposed in 1983 and was supposed to be the government of Ontario's way to build transit cheaply for a lot of people. It would have used what was called intermediate capacity transit, which is something not quite as busy as a subway or can't hold as many people as a subway, but more than a heavy rail train, more which is like Go Transit my bad. Go Transit's existing trains that run today. So you can, for a visual of what these trains would have looked like, originally the TTC Line 3 Scarborough trains were intended to be for Go ALRT. Some lines on Go ALRT would have traveled from Hamilton to Oshawa, going through downtown Toronto Union Station, following the existing Lakeshore line, But as opposed to the existing Lakeshore line, which at the time ran hourly, this line would have run up to every 2 minutes. So it
Every
would have
two
been a,
minutes.
yep, it would have been a light metro across the region up to every 2 minutes from Hamilton to Oshawa. Additionally, there was a line from Oakville to Pickering through northern Toronto, running along either Finch or through Scarborough Town Center, connecting Pearson Airport to the line as well. That would have also ran every 2 minutes. Um, on top of that, there was also two additional proposed lines along here, Ontario and Derry, or Dixie Road, my bad, that would have gone from Port Credit to Brampton Station on the Lakeshore West line and Georgetown line, as well as Long Branch to Queen East on Dixie Road. These lines would have all together would have built a robust transit network that would have transported millions of people per day. Um, as you wouldn't even need a schedule as they ran every 2 minutes, so you could just hop on and go. It's unfortunately it was never built.
So I understand that some of the secrets of this would have been, as you said, electrification so that you can stop and start far quicker. And that's one of the challenges with our current GO trains is because they have a long time to accelerate and a long time to decelerate. They've got to have a greater headspace between the trains. So you can't get the frequency that you've got on a subway or on a SkyTrain and or something like this ALRT. And that second of all, you achieve the same capacity as you have on a big train by having far greater frequency. And I think that makes sense because the far greater frequency actually provides more convenient capacity rather than having to wait half an hour for the next big train. And then the final big benefit, and I've had a lot of transit consultants tell me this, is they've said that you don't understand that you're actually spending as much money on the stations as you are on all of the track and the vehicles that move. And if you have shorter, more frequent service, you can half the size of the stations and you can get rid of a quarter of the cost. And that makes a ton of sense to me. What do you think?
Oh yeah, for sure. These trains would have run either 2 or 4 car consists, so they would have been extremely short, um, less than half the size of our current GO stations, which means that they could build stations in more places, cheaper, and also just easier to build. They're quicker, half the size of current ones. They don't need big canopies along 300 meters of track. Um, it also for electrification, uh, because you can accelerate and decelerate faster, it means they could also build plenty of infill stations along these lines. You can see on the map there was going to be one at Highway 8 and Hamilton West in Hamilton, as well as one between Bronte and Oakville GO stations named Oakville West Station. These stations would have been
Brand new
uh,
stations.
brand new stations, and right now they don't exist because GO trains take too long to accelerate and decelerate, something that isn't an issue with electrified trains.
You had another one that was a fascinating high-speed rail that we talked about that went all the way from Burlington to the junction, to the DuPont, to Summerhill, and then out to Pickering or the Pickering Airport. It just sounds fascinating.
So these lines were part of SuperGo, as mentioned before, and they would have been the secondary proposals for the project. The initial proposal was just electrified service along Lakeshore between Hamilton and Oshawa, um, as well as Brampton and Union Station. These lines would have been proposed separately, but at the same time. So, as you said, yep, between Pickering Airport and Pickering to Burlington through Summerhill and DuPont stations, they would have provided transit access to hundreds of thousands of people that still don't have access to transit today.
I think
And
the Lakeshore line is really interesting. And one of the big benefits that I think that we don't have with our current service is enough stations. And here, and just focusing on sort of the Mississauga area, you've got the Clarkson station, but you've actually added a station between Clarkson and Oakville at Ford Drive. And, so many people in Southeast Oakville they drive to Clarkson. And so you have these big, huge parking lots and a whole bunch of congestion getting into that Clarkson Go because you don't have something serving Southeast Oakville. Ford Drive would take it. You've added another one at Fourth Line. Then in Mississauga, the Port Credit one exists, but you're adding one at Cawthra. There's been proposals to add one at Cawthra or Ogden or something in that area, particularly given the size of the Lakeview development that's going to have 25 to 50,000 people. And then, interesting in Toronto, adding something at Kipling, at Humber, and at Sunnyside. You've really added a far more frequent service that sort of makes it more like a subway rather than the existing GO train that some people think is almost like a freight train.
Yeah, as mentioned before, in GO LRT, electric trains can accelerate and decelerate faster, which means that you can add more stations in between that wouldn't affect travel time. Super Go fully realizes this ability and adds dozens of infill stations along the Lakeshore and Brampton line. As you mentioned, Ford, Cawthra, Sunnyside, and Humber Bay, these are very important stations that would serve thousands of people today if they were built. But if you go further east, you can see additional stations at Coxwell, Warden, and Queen, which all would have been in Toronto and would have been extremely well used. Some of these are being, some of these have the possibility to still be built today, but if they were built in the 70s, way before the population in Toronto expanded, it could change how Toronto looked, with a major electrified line going east-west. There could have been development all along the eastern part of Toronto supporting this line.
This west segment is fascinating, as we talked about. Look at the number of extra stations that would have been built. As you mentioned, Fourth Line, Ford, Lauren Park, Cawthra, Kipling, Mimico, Humber, Sunnyside.
Yes, there were, and as you mentioned, it would have been metro-like service along this line and up to every 4 minutes in the SuperGo project, which means that you could just show up and go at any time. And it would have been two-way all day, not commuter rail service, which means that you could go towards Hamilton in the morning, towards Toronto in the evening. You can make your dinner plans at any time, like you mentioned earlier, because you could just hop on any train you want. It would have been great if it was built.
So it's almost a doubling in the number of stations between Hamilton and Union Station.
Yeah, pretty much. They really realized how much electrified service could allow them to add more stations, and I think this is probably the most you could add.
Why isn't this getting built? Why aren't you doubling the number of stations on the Lakeshore line?
So I'm not sure why Metrolinx today isn't considering building a lot of infill stations. With the current GO expansion project, travel times will be reducing significantly because of shorter consists and electrified service. Maybe they just don't have the confidence that the planners in the 1970s had about adding plenty of infill stations. Maybe they would prefer faster service from the existing ones right now. But yeah, I think multiple extra stations along Lakeshore would be perfect. I think one at Humber is being built at Park Lawn. It's going to be its name. The Lakeview development might have one. And Walker's Line was a concerted station at one point in Burlington, but that was cut. Yeah, Lakeshore could sustain multiple extra stations today if they wanted to.
They need to, but they need to electrify because of this acceleration, deceleration issue. And one of the other things is, you've got to think through the express versus local. I've used this example before, you may know it well, but back in the 1910s or 20s, they built the 7th Avenue subway in New York, and it's one of the most successful subways in the world. And one of the reasons why is they've got 4 tunnels. They've got both the local and express. And here you've got, I think it's 16 stations between Hamilton and Union Station. That means probably 32 minutes or so just in the station alone. That adds dramatically to the travel time if you're traveling plus sitting in a whole bunch of stations. But if you've got another line that's an express, so you don't have to choose to go through the milk run that stops everywhere, it dramatically improves. And I've done this on numerous times, because I got to tell you, I take the Clarkson Express to downtown Toronto. The Clarkson Express is, I think, 5 or 7 minutes faster than the local. You can't get a seat on the Clarkson Express, and a couple of minutes later, the local leaves, and you can always get a seat. So people are willing to stand to save 5 to 7 minutes. So having the extra line that allows you to have a express as well as a local makes a ton of sense. What do you think?
For sure. And the planners in 1970s for Supergo did see this. The Lakeshore line at the time was only 2 tracks between Toronto and Hamilton. And in the Supergo plan, they wanted to add 4 tracks along the entire line, with fifth bypass tracks along certain sections, which means that this line could sustain a frequent all-day express service between Hamilton and Toronto, as well as local service along that stops at every station.
What a
It would
shame
have
that
been
it wasn't.
perfect.
What a shame that it wasn't built. It's just incredible. We're going to take another break for some messages and be back with WB Metro in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting with a gentleman by the name of WB Metro. He has a Twitter handled by that name, and he really is a transit advocate and someone that just takes a look at some of the transit ideas that are going on in the Greater Toronto Area. And he confronts us with our past thinking, and I think makes us think bigger. And I think we don't have enough of that big thinking in our city and in our province and in our Metrolinks today. WB, welcome back. I want to show you, and maybe you can explain to all of our listeners, this crosstown rail link. It's going on the CP lines from Mississauga to that Summerhill LCBO, right?
Yes. So this line, not to be confused with the Eglinton Crosstown line, this line was proposed in 2008 by Metrolinx in their first regional transit plan, named the Big Move. You might be familiar with that name. This project basically kicked off everything about GO expansion. This is where the whole idea of electrified service, expanded service, really began. And today, GO expansion is the result of that. However, there has been multiple changes since the big move started, and one of them is this line right here, which was cut. This line would have gone from Cooksville Station on the Milton line, passing through Dixie Kipling Station, and then stopping at DuPont Station, transferring to the Line 1 subway, as well as Summerhill, also a Line 1 subway station. This line would have used the CP Midtown Corridor, as you mentioned, and would have provided commuter rail service between Cooksville and Summerhill. One thing about this proposal, though, is it was not all-day service. This was only going to run at rush hours. It basically would have acted as a link between Milton Line customers at Cooksville, and gave them an option to transfer to this line to continue to DuPont or Summerhill as opposed to Toronto Union Station.
And why would it start at Cooksville rather than, all the way from Milton?
I'm not really sure, honestly. I believe.
So I think there's two issues that you got on that Milton Mississauga line. One is it's expensive to cross the Credit River with additional bridges, and there's an at-grade crossing that's on an angle on Mississauga Road, just south of Streetsville. And so as they've thought about taking it farther west than Cooksville, you do have some major infrastructure changes that would need to be implemented. But from Cooksville on, my understanding is that there's not a lot of infrastructure changes that would have to take place. And Cooksville, obviously, it would connect up with the Hurontario LRT. And Cooksville, it's Hurontario, it's sort of close to the center of population in Mississauga. Dixie has an opportunity for a fairly substantial growth. Kipling, you would connect in with the existing GO, the existing subway that goes across Bloor Street. And then, as you mentioned, DuPont and Summerhill connecting in with the University line and the Yonge line, as you appropriately corrected me, line 1. So connecting into the major other routes that exist in the network. But I think this is, and it comes back to my comment about the Elizabeth line. I'm not sure if you followed the press, but in London, England, they had no rail that crossed the city. It came to the city, but didn't cross the city. And so what they did with the Elizabeth line is they crossed the city. And this would be comparable to what we're talking about right now with this crosstown. And it has been unbelievably popular and has dramatically increased passenger usage in London, England. And the article that came out, it was equal to 28 lanes of freeway traffic in Houston. It carried that much traffic. It's astounding, isn't it?
It is. It's really amazing what lines not going through the major downtown areas could do, and just going between metro areas on either side of the city. Paired with this proposal in 2008, there was also another one on the Havelock line, it was called, between, we don't have the map on us right now, but between somewhere in Durham region to Summerhill Station. So these two lines combined would have been that cross rail service that you were mentioning between both sides of the cities. The one issue with this project, and I think it boils down to Metrolinx's mindset in 2008, was more expand the network rather than expand the existing services on the network. All these additional expansions that they forecasted, they were all going to be peak only, which means trains in the morning and out in the evening. And if you want to go the other direction, you just can't. There's no trains going that direction, only following commuter hours.
I don't think that makes much sense at all. I think if you're going to establish that network across the middle of the city, you should have it all the time. I had a traffic transportation consultant that described it at one point in time and said, think about Toronto without the 401. If you made all the freeway traffic go through the Gardiner Expressway and the Don Valley Parkway, that would be comparable to just having the Lakeshore line. But because we added the 401, you had allowed a lot of transit traffic, transportation to go across the top of the city. And they said, we need another transit line that crosses the city, not just forcing everyone to go through the Lakeshore line. And the option was either that mid-Toronto CP line that crosses right in the middle of the city, or using the CN line that crosses the city north of the 407 or near the 407. And his argument was that the population center, you know, at Mississauga, at DuPont, Roncesvalles area, at Casa Loma, at Summerhill, at the Science Center, and going out to Scarborough makes a ton of sense to be the route that crosstown takes, particularly given that the railway line is already there.
For sure. I think it was a problem with Metrolinx's mindset in 2008 when they proposed the big move. They proposed multiple network expansions, such as the Bolton line, a line to Peterborough/Havelock, as well as one to Seaton, Ontario. And they really thinned out their resources to be able to, or they would have thinned out the resources if they were to enact these expansions. So what they did later on was cancel all of these new lines and instead use the resources they had, or they were going to put into those lines, and put them into the existing network and expand the existing network. And I think that's a better use of resources over building 5 new lines that would have been peak only that we would need to expand in a couple years anyway. I think it's better. Sorry, go ahead.
What about this line that you've got, the Orangeville line? Where would have it gone?
So this line was proposed in 1963 by the government of Ontario, and it would have gone from Toronto Union Station through Cooksville along the Milton line to Streetsville, and then it would have branched off on a rail line that goes north to Orangeville through Brampton, Ontario, which would have connected with the Go Kitchener line.
So this one is kind of interesting because just last week, Peel Council have dedicated the line all the way north of Streetsville for a walking trail, biking trail, exercise trail, and they're, I presume, going to pick up the iron that's in the ground for the rail line. This actually intersects in downtown Brampton with the GO line that goes from Georgetown through Brampton to downtown, and it could go by, Mayfield Road, the north end of Brampton, and go through Caledon, and Caledon is supposed to go from 50,000 people to 500,000 people over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. So it's going to be an area that's going to grow dramatically. And when you think about sort of going down to Cooksville, you're going to have a Hurontario LRT that's going to be low capacity, low speed, maybe more frequent service. I think this would have sort of been the express. And I think it's a shame that I don't know if it makes sense right now, but particularly as Brampton expands and has expanded, and as Caledon goes from 50,000 to 500,000 people, this would have made a ton of sense. I travel a lot. And if you go to Boston, if you go to New York, if you go to London, England, a lot of their trains are frequent in the center of the city. And then when they get to the outskirts, they branch out like a tree would branch out. And so, one person told me that you could never justify the frequent service to Milton. But if you had one train that, came from Brampton or Orangeville, and the next train came from Milton, and they merged at Streetsville, and so you had twice as frequent service from Streetsville south, then you start to justify that kind of service. And that's, for some reason, something we haven't done in the Greater Toronto areas. We haven't had trains that as they get to the outskirts and less frequent, less demand, they don't branch out. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's a great idea. I think for the line to Orangeville specifically, there's been a lot of discourse about the abandonment of this line and how it should have been used for passenger rail service, such as this line. I agree with you that I don't think full service to Milton could be fully justified initially right now, but having it branch off to Orangeville and have some trains continuing to Milton, it would be perfect. It would be twice the amount of frequency to Streetsville, and then Milton and Orangeville would see the benefits of slightly less frequency, but service in general.
This post that you made was fascinating to me, because what you did is you compared the frequency of train service in 2018 versus 2023. Can you explain this to me, please?
So this actually isn't the frequency of service right now. This is the Go expansion project that this is the service they were proposing at the time. So as you can see at the top, it says in 2018 concept, it's the Metrolinx expansion final business case, which was their, at the time, final business case for Go expansion. It shows departures for the Lakeshore West line between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. And in the 2018 concept, there was going to be 7 departures, which is roughly a train every 8 minutes, roughly. If you go over to the 2023 concept, this is what I found in a Union Station enhancement project document that shows the brand new Encore development phase for Go expansion. And Encore is the company that has now taken the planning from Metrolinx and they're designing it themselves. And this is the amount of trains that they're forecasting in their plan now. So it's gone from seven
to 18.
departures, 7 planned departures to 18 planned departures when Go expansion is finished. You can see the increase in scope of the Go expansion project by looking at these two. Because in the 2018 concept, 7 departures with electrified service, that's not that many at all. That's a lot today to us, but it's not a lot to the future. And I think the new planners from Encore really realized this. And now 18 departures, it mimics a subway service. And it's great to see the increased scope of Go expansion.
You've got a Islington-Brampton line rail corridor from Brampton to Streetsville to Arundel to Cawthra to West Mall to Islington. This sort of looks like the one we just looked at that went to Georgetown.
Yeah, so this one is a smaller version of that. It was proposed in 1969 as a part of a document that looked at alternative routes for expansion for Go. So one of these lines was from Brampton to Streetsville, Arundel, Cawthra, Westmall, and then it would terminate as Islington, which is where it would meet with a planned subway line, which is now TTC Line 2. Um, this line would have gone very close to where downtown Mississauga is today, and it would have connected right to downtown Brampton, which means it would provide a really good link between both of those downtowns, which is something that we just don't have today. I'm not even sure if local transit between those two areas is very good.
It's not. And the Huron Ontario LRT isn't going to stop at Shoppers World. It's not going to even go to downtown Brampton. And
No,
as I
it's
mentioned
not.
earlier, this would have gone straight from, Brampton to Mississauga. The other thing I like about this one is that it's proposing to stop at Cawthra and West Mall, and the rail line crosses Dundas at Cawthra. So it's a really logical place to put in a stop. And then the West Mall or the East Mall, I think, make a ton of sense, particularly because right now at Cloverdale, they're proposing, which is right there at the 427 in Dundas, they're proposing 16 towers, all between 40 and 50 stories high. It's going to be a major little city. And so having something at the West Mall or the East Mall right there at the 427 makes a ton of sense. It's just fascinating, some of these proposals that have been looked at in the past. I think it would have been great if some of them would have been built. It's a shame that they haven't. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and come back with our guest, WB Metro, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Having a fascinating conversation with WB Metro, who's a Twitter guy who posts frequently on transit. You wanted to come back to this frequency argument again. What do you want to tell me?
So for this, I just wanted to say that the 2023 concept with the 18 departures, that's not currently confirmed. That's just a part of the Encore development phase. So when the 2-year development cycle for Go expansion is complete, it might look different from this. That's all I want to touch on, just in case someone might believe that it's 100% likely that we're going to get 18 trains per hour on Lakeshore. There's a chance it might not happen. That's all I want to say.
You had another one that was I guess it's an elevated SkyTrain or ALRT along Erin Mills from Clarkson to Meadowvale. Tell me about this one if you could.
So this was a part of a project, a very ambitious project called Go Urban. This was before Go ALRT and also a little bit before Super Go, the two projects we touched on earlier. This would have been, was the government's original idea for a cheap way to build transit across our region. It involved low capacity maglev trains, and maglevs are very unproven technology that don't really work out too well. They're very specialized and they can really only work in certain areas. The government of Ontario was going to go full in on this technology and build dozens of these lines across our region. And I'm currently working on a map right now that is going to outline all of the proposed maps. Here's another one right here on the Derry Road. But there was Go Urban lines proposed in Hamilton, Ottawa, Toronto, Pickering, as well. The government of Ontario wanted to export this technology to cities like Rio de Janeiro and Mexico City. The technology itself was being developed in West Germany, and would have been very, very small, pod-like trains running along a single magnet rail. This technology turned out to be very, very unreliable. It could not run in snow. It could not run fast around corners. It was very noisy. So just as they were going to begin construction of one of the first prototype lines, they just had to cancel the project. And all of these lines were canceled. The one that we're looking at right now is the Go Urban Derry line, which would have gone from Meadowvale, where Meadowvale Go Station is today, to Malton Airport, which is now known as Pearson Airport.
The idea here that I think has some real merit is that Huron Ontario LRT now goes from Port Credit Go to the Cooksville GO to Square One area, Mississauga downtown, up to the 401, past the 407 and into Brampton, but stops at Shoppers World in Brampton. And I think that makes no sense. It should have gone from a GO train station to a GO train station, and it could have and should have gone, right up here, Ontario, into Brampton to stop at that Brampton GO. And if it's not going to, I wonder whether this one makes sense. Turn it east and take it along Derry to Pearson Airport. We have terrible transit in Malton because, it's one of the lowest income parts of Mississauga. And the only GO transit they have is to take them really downtown because it doesn't go, out of the city. It only goes inbound. And I think that if you had this going along Derry, preferably, or maybe even Steeles, but along Derry, you'd be able to give transit to all those people living in Malton to get to the industrial warehouse and office stuff that is west of the airport, west of Malton, where I think a lot of them work. One of the ironic things in Mississauga, is that we've got some of the best transit in the more well-to-do areas, and we've got some of the worst transit in the lower income areas. And so while I don't think that the ALRT or the elevated, is doable today, I think something like that Hurontario LRT turning and going along Derry to Pearson Airport. And then frankly, I would take it south of Pearson Airport to connect up with the terminus of the BRT, the bus rapid transit that comes from Square One that goes to the airport corporate zone, but then terminates again. They all should connect in. You know what? This has been a fascinating conversation. I think it all comes back to that first slide that you had, which is that the existing railway network that we've got in and around the Toronto area is a huge resource. And we've exploited it somewhat, but we haven't exploited it to the extent we could. One of the ones that's been talked about is potentially a train that goes through Woodbridge and Bolton. That hasn't been exploited. And I do think that this mid-Toronto one that goes right through the Annex, Summerhill, Science Center, et cetera, is one of the other ones that really could and should be exploited. What do you think of the future of transit in the Greater Toronto Area? Are you excited about it, or are you worried that we're less ambitious than we should be?
I think right now I'm very excited. As we touched on earlier, we could see the increase in scope for Lakeshore service for GO expansion, from initially planned 7 trains per hour to planned 18 trains per hour. That in itself shows to me that the province is taking the expansion of transit a lot more seriously. I think that what GO expansion is currently doing, which is upgrading all 7 of the GO lines, is just the beginning. I think there is plenty of chances to build the Midtown line from Summerhill to Toronto, and I think the government will look into that one in the future. It'll probably be what I imagine is like a phase 2 of GO expansion, maybe after the Kurt Rana projects are completed. They could go back, see what else is majorly needed, and then start building those. The Bolton line is another thing that is currently going through consideration, I believe. I'm pretty sure that line is probably going to be the next one that GO builds. Overall, I'm excited for transit in our region.
WB Metro, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So my final comment would be, I think that everything they're doing in the Lakeshore line is fantastic, and I agree. I do think that they should be adding an extra station, just like they're adding one at the Mr. Christie site, which is a 25-acre development at Park Lawn and the QEW or the Gardner. With a 120-acre development at Lakeview, there needs to be better transit to it, and either a station or a route that goes down into that Lakeview power generating station makes a ton of sense. So whether that's Cawthra or Ogden or Dixie, somehow you've got to get better transit to that massive population increase in Lakeview. And then I think we've been talking about all day, 2-way frequent GO train service on the Milton Mississauga line, seemingly forever. And as I mentioned earlier, that Western Freight Bypass was proposed in the 1960s when the Eastern Freight Bypass was actually proposed and built, and saved us all of that freight rail traffic on the Lakeshore line. Why we didn't do it, the Western Freight Bypass then, is beyond me. And we suffered the result of the 1978 derailment. And I firmly believe I hope not, but I firmly believe at some point in time in the future, we're going to have a massive derailment somewhere on that CP line in the middle of urban Mississauga or Toronto, and every politician and every railway executive will rue the day that they didn't build that Western Freight bypass and get that dangerous freight out of urban Toronto. And if you did, you would build the best cross rail we could ever imagine, going right through the center of our city. And I do think that we're missing out on an opportunity to connect Peel region together and the growing area of Caledon by giving up that Orangeville to Streetsville railway. Just as, I think the Woodbridge to Bolton rail line makes sense, just as the rail line that goes through Aurora, Newmarket up to Barrie makes sense, just as the one to Richmond Hill makes sense, just as the one from Markham and Stouffville makes sense. The one from Mississauga to Brampton to Caledon makes a ton of sense, and we shouldn't give it up. It's there.
We
it's owned
definitely
by
should
the
not.
city.
It's a very important rail corridor, and once it's gone, it's gone. We
It's gone
need
forever.
to. It's gone forever. We need to save it now, or else the major connection between Brampton and Milton, or Brampton and Mississauga and onwards to Toronto Union Station, is lost forever. And that's
And
something we can't afford in this region. We need major connections across this region, and that's a major one that we need.
WB, I've spoken to people in Collingwood because there was a rail line that went from Collingwood to Barrie. They pulled it up. I've spoken to people in Niagara Falls. There was a rail line from the GO train station in Niagara Falls right through Clifton Hill to the casino and to the falls itself. We pulled it up. Everyone says once you pull it up, you can never get it back, and it's the biggest mistake you can make. It's short-term thinking.
Exactly. And a trail, while a trail would be great, it's not as important as a rail line can be. A trail can bring locals to the area. A rail line can bring everyone to the area.
WB, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.